The flood was supposed to end it. That is the version most of us grew up hearing in Sunday school classrooms and quiet suburban churches, where the story of Noah closes like a sealed chapter and the giants vanish beneath the rising waters without a trace or consequence. But here is the problem that very few Americans ever stop to consider. If the flood erased the Nephilim completely, why does the Bible itself mention giants again, long after the ark rested and the earth began to breathe once more? In Genesis 6, we are told about the mighty men of old, the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men, beings described as warriors of renown, towering figures whose presence reshaped the early world before judgment fell like a global reset. Then the waters come, 40 days, endless rain, mountains swallowed, civilizations erased, the deep breaks open. Humanity is reduced to a single family floating above a drowned world that once trembled beneath something not entirely human. You would expect silence after that. You would expect the bloodline to be gone, buried beneath layers of sediment and myth. Nothing more than a cautionary tale about rebellion and corruption in an ancient world that no longer exists. Yet centuries later, in the land of Canaan, the Israelite spies return with a report that should stop every careful reader in their tracks. We saw the Nephilim there, they say, describing themselves as grasshoppers in comparison. Grasshoppers, that is not poetic exaggeration. That is language of scale, of proportion, of something physically overwhelming enough to trigger fear in hardened men who had just walked through a divided sea and watched an empire collapse behind them. So the question becomes unavoidable. If the flood wiped them out, how are giants standing in Canaan hundreds of years later? Either the biblical writers are confused, or something survived, and that possibility changes everything. Before we jump to conclusions, we have to slow down and examine the text carefully, because serious investigation requires discipline, not hype. The Book of Enoch describes the corruption of humanity through forbidden knowledge and hybrid offspring before the flood. It presents the giants not simply as tall humans, but as the visible result of a boundary being crossed. A violation between realms that introduced chaos into the created order and accelerated violence until judgment became inevitable. But Enoch also describes something else that many modern readers overlook. It speaks about the spirits of the giants remaining active after their physical destruction, wandering the earth, influencing humanity from behind the curtain of visibility. Now pause right there, because even if you do not accept Enoch as canonical scripture, it represents Second Temple Jewish thought. The worldview that shaped how ancient Hebrews understood Genesis and the unseen dimension around them. So here is a more nuanced possibility. The physical giants before the flood may have perished, but the corruption they introduced did not disappear as easily as bones beneath water. Ideas survive, bloodlines survive, influence survives. Genesis 6 contains a subtle phrase that most English readers skip without noticing. It says, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward." 2 words, also afterward. That clause refuses to go away quietly. After what? After the initial corruption, after the flood. Scholars debate the timeline, but the phrase itself creates narrative tension, suggesting continuity rather than total erasure, a thread that continues into later biblical history. When Israel enters Canaan, they encounter the Anakim, the Rephaim, the Emim, multiple groups described as unusually tall, formidable, ancient, occupying territories with names that echo something older and more terrifying than ordinary tribal warfare. Even Goliath, centuries later, stands as a reminder that extraordinary stature and battlefield dominance did not vanish from the human story. His armor is described in weight, his spear compared to a weaver's beam. Details matter. These descriptions are not written like fairy tales. They are recorded with measurements, lineage references, geographic markers, and battle outcomes. That level of specificity forces us to treat the narrative seriously instead of dismissing it as folklore. Now, let's consider a second possibility that few people discuss calmly. What if the post-flood giants were not a direct continuation of the original Nephilim, but a new corruption that mirrored the first? A pattern repeating in cycles. If the boundary between realms was crossed once, what guarantees it could not be crossed again? The ancient world was not naive about spiritual rebellion. It was saturated with the language of watchers, divine councils, and cosmic conflict. The flood may have been a reset, but resets do not erase free will. They do not eliminate unseen intelligences. They do not rewrite every genetic variable in an instant. They interrupt, they warn, they limit. They do not always conclude. So when we see giants again after the flood, we are confronted with a layered mystery. Are we looking at diluted bloodlines preserved through one of Noah's daughters-in-law? Are we looking at regional myth amplifying large warriors? Or are we staring at a narrative that insists the human story is entangled with something larger? Something that did not drown easily and continues to surface at strategic points in history, like a shadow refusing extinction. This is where modern readers often swing to extremes. Either total denial, reducing everything to exaggeration, or sensational claims that ignore textual nuance and historical context. Both approaches miss the deeper investigation required, because the real tension is not simply about height. It is about corruption, influence, power structures, ancient warfare, spiritual worldview. The giants function in the biblical narrative as symbols of overwhelming opposition to covenant purpose. And if they appear both before and after the flood, then the flood did not end the struggle. It merely marked a boundary in a longer war that stretches from Genesis to the prophetic visions of final restoration. So here is the real question for you. When ancient texts mention giants after a global reset, are they preserving memory, recording history, or warning future generations about patterns that resurface whenever humanity drifts toward forbidden knowledge again? Because what happened to the giants after the flood may not be about bones in the dirt. It may be about understanding how corruption adapts, how rebellion mutates, and how history carries echoes that refuse to stay buried beneath water. If the giants appear again after the flood, then we are forced to widen the lens beyond a simple extinction narrative and begin asking harder questions about how ancient civilizations preserved memory, how oral traditions traveled across continents, and why so many cultures describe towering beings in their earliest records. From Mesopotamia to the Americas, from Greece to the Near East, we encounter stories of larger-than-life warriors, hybrid heroes, and primordial rulers whose stature sets them apart from ordinary men. And the consistency of that motif demands investigation rather than dismissal. Now, before imagination runs wild, let's ground ourselves in responsible analysis. Ancient societies often used exaggerated language to express dominance, strength, or military superiority, so some references to giants may reflect hyperbole rather than biology. But here is where the tension remains. Not every reference reads like metaphor. Some include measured cubits, named fathers, clan structures, burial sites, and battle outcomes that anchor the narrative in physical geography rather than mythic abstraction. The Rephaim, for example, are described as a people group inhabiting specific territories east of the Jordan. King Og of Bashan is said to have an iron bed measured in cubits, a detail recorded almost casually, as if readers could verify it. Why include that measurement unless the author expected the audience to understand it as tangible reality rather than symbolic poetry? That is the kind of detail that separates legend from documented memory in ancient writing traditions. At the same time, archaeology has not uncovered confirmed skeletons of 12-foot warriors walking through the Bronze Age. And any serious investigation must admit that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So we stand in a balanced position. The text records giants after the flood. The historical record provides no universally accepted physical proof. The cultural memory across civilizations keeps repeating the motif. That triangle creates mystery. One explanation proposed by some scholars is genetic diversity within early post-flood populations. If humanity experienced a bottleneck event, unusual physical traits could have amplified within isolated tribes, producing individuals of exceptional height. We know from modern medicine that gigantism exists. Hormonal irregularities can produce dramatic stature differences within ordinary families. Scale that across centuries, combine it with tribal isolation, and you begin to see a plausible framework. Yet the biblical narrative frames these figures not merely as tall, but as intimidating oppositional forces tied to territories associated with spiritual resistance. which introduces another layer beyond biology alone. Notice how the giants often occupy strategic land: QAnon, Bashan, Philistine territory. These are not random geographic footnotes. They are narrative flashpoints, places where covenant purpose collides with entrenched power structures. In that sense, giants function as narrative embodiments of overwhelming resistance. They represent systems too large to conquer, enemies too strong to defeat, obstacles that make ordinary warriors feel like grasshoppers by comparison. When David faces Goliath, the text emphasizes armor weight, spear size, bronze gleam under sunlight, the rhythmic thunder of footsteps across the valley floor. The imagery is cinematic, grounded, almost tactile in its realism. But the story is not primarily about anatomy. It is about power reversal. The small defeating the massive, covenant over intimidation, trust over fear. The giant is narrative tension made visible. Now return to the flood question. If the giants symbolize corruption and overwhelming resistance, then their reappearance after the flood communicates something profound. Judgment did not erase the human capacity for rebellion or domination. The flood reset geography, but it did not erase the moral architecture of free will. Human societies rebuilt, cities rose, kings declared themselves divine, violence resurfaced, power consolidated, the pattern returned in new forms. So when ancient writers record giants again, they may be preserving memory of unusually large warriors, but they are also encoding theological commentary about recurring corruption in human history. And this is where modern readers must be careful. It is tempting to leap from ancient giants to modern conspiracies, from Bronze Age battles to 21st century speculation. But responsible study draws lines instead of blurring them recklessly. The Book of Enoch describes spirits of the giants remaining active, influencing humanity through deception and violence. Whether one views that literally or symbolically, the theme is clear. Corruption adapts. Influence lingers. After the flood, humanity was given a fresh start, but the inclination toward power without accountability did not vanish. Towers were built again, empires rose again, idolatry returned again. The pattern reasserted itself. So what happened to the giants after the flood? Physically, they likely existed in diminished form, perhaps as unusually tall clans, remembered through amplified storytelling. Spiritually and symbolically, the pattern they represented continued. History teaches that overwhelming systems reappear in every generation. Tyrants rise, militaries dominate, economies concentrate power. To ancient audiences, the language of giants communicated that sense of something too large to confront alone. And yet every giant story in Scripture ends the same way. Not through superior size, but through covenant alignment. Not through intimidation, but through trust. The narrative arc consistently dismantles what appears unstoppable. That arc matters more than speculation about skeletal remains. It reminds readers that scale does not equal supremacy, and that history, even when it seems dominated by towering forces, bends under something deeper than physical height. If giants survived the flood in some measurable way, they did not survive indefinitely. They disappear from the record. They fade from prominence. They are defeated, absorbed, forgotten, or transformed into legend. What remains is the lesson embedded within their memory. Overwhelming power structures rise in every era, but none of them are permanent. They appear invincible. They intimidate. They occupy territory. Then they fall. So perhaps the better question is not whether 12-foot warriors walked the earth after the flood. Perhaps the more enduring question is why every civilization remembers giants at all, and what that says about humanity's struggle with power. Because the story of giants after the flood is ultimately a story about scale versus sovereignty, intimidation versus covenant, and the recurring human temptation to build systems so large that they overshadow the moral boundaries meant to protect us. And if that pattern still exists today, then the ancient question is no longer about archaeology alone. It becomes a mirror, a reminder, a warning wrapped in narrative form, preserved for those willing to read carefully instead of react impulsively. What happened to the giants after the flood? They diminished. They were defeated. They were remembered. and the pattern they symbolized continues to challenge every generation that believes size alone determines destiny.